Hello, this is going to be some like kind of an extension of the around the world in 5 hours talk I did for about Sweden. I did this in Kiev last Saturday, what is it, May 26th or May 25th, for the Ukrainian Leadership Academy. And thanks to Elizabeth Kim for inviting me out to that. Um, I kind of wanted to be able to speak longer and explain kind of more why I did it, and just get to put it on the internet. So basically, uh, it's the whole output problem, right? This is kind of something I thought about all while I was growing up. When I was, when you're young, you think about, well, I'm 29 now, but when I was in high school and early in college, you get a lot of those feelings as a young person. Why is there injustice in the world? Why are there problems? How do we help? And the next thing is, first you learn about it, then you move on. You try to think, well, how can I fix it? What can I do better? My next logical step, my progression was to ask people what is the best outcome. What places have outcomes, the output basically of where people are happy, where things work. And me growing up in California, take that for what you will. A lot of people told me that Scandinavia and Sweden particularly was a good example of where things are going right. Right? I mean, you don't have to be from California to look at surveys that say that Scandinavians and Swedes are some of the happiest people in the world, that they have great outcomes in education. I'll show some graphs later, but their governments work. There's a lot of high level of trust in the society. And as I, started going to school, I'll show this first. I ended up studying abroad for a summer at Lund Universitet in Sweden. It was the first time I went abroad because I wanted to personally learn more and see what the country was about, and if people were right, did things go well, and how did they work? And I did learn a lot. Here's me looking like a tourist, because I was one, and desperately trying to fit in with bleached hair so that I could pretend to be blonde. I don't know what my logic was there, but I kept it. Yeah, so this is the normal presentation stuff. Normally, when a lot of people think about Sweden, IKEA, cars, forests, maybe not necessarily. People are not necessarily thinking, "Oh, can we look at Sweden for how we can make the best outcomes in our society?" But that's what this is going to be, because that's what I want to talk about. So, yeah, basically basics. If you don't know, Sweden's in Europe. It's part of the EU, but it's not part of the monetary union. That's important because they control their monetary policy, so they can, they can inflate their currency. They can let it float relative to other currencies in the world. Their economy isn't tied, monetarily. Their currency isn't tied to what Germany's currency is, which is, like a problem for Greece, which has the euro, and their economy is directly compared to Germany's because they both use the euro. So if the German economy is doing really well and people want their products, it's going to affect Greece and how much their currency is worth. And of course, a currency that's worth less relative to others means it's better for exports, right? You can sell more abroad if people can buy your products more cheaply, and that math works out better for an export-driven economy, which Sweden is, to have their own currency. And their people seem to understand that. They voted to not accept the euro. So good choice for them, and we'll see why they make good choices like this. Uh, I'm supposed to have basically done some culture and background, kind of to prove that I know a little bit about Sweden. Köttbullar and lingonberry, smorgasbord, knäckebröd, tune, brödrulle. Not the top right. That's not necessarily the most. This isn't the most Swedish-looking thing, but I've been assured that you can find that on street corners and in markets and gas stations. Yeah, knackerbröd, definitely something you don't eat plain. I found that out when I thought I would. Oh, a cheap crackers. I like crackers. Let me just buy these, and it's basically like eating cardboard. When I told Swedish people that, they laughed and said, "Oh, you were supposed to put other things on it. It's like really healthy bread." So put other stuff on it for sure. Yep. So let's continue. I did sport as well. What are Swedes known for? Hockey. Maybe they're not as. They're one of the countries that is up there. You obviously have Zlatan, and they're famous for tennis. They have some Bjorn Borgs out there, and their pop music. So this is how I was leading into how Swedes are fairly successful. I mean, there's only around 10 million people in their country, yet they have a very outsized impact on the rest of the world, in part because of their culture and how they export music. They have very famous acts, ABBA, Avicii, Ace of Base, Robin, and of course this guy Max Martin, who is one of the leading producers in the world. I think he has the second most Billboard Top 100 hits, with him credited as a producer ever. I think behind the Beatles, the guy who produced the Beatles music. Yeah. Traditions, things Swedes do. I had a video for them, Swedish Midsummer for Dummies. It's similar maybe to Ukrainian summers parties, but yeah, everyone gets around to the table and drinks and sings songs. And I got a call. Don't worry about that. But for me, the most important thing to relate in traditions is this fika, which is a time to relax, have coffee, and talk. It's more than gossiping. And I don't need to do more about this later. I'll just talk about it now. It's a time when they can share problems, issues in a relaxed manner where it's culturally acceptable to be direct and speak openly about things that you want to have better in life. Maybe not necessarily political things, things that can just be in a normal everyday sense of the word that is bothering you want to fix in your relationships. But for me, that was an important part of being able to talk about difficult issues. Other traditions that are important: Christmas, midsummer. But for me, the fika part is very pivotal towards having a cultural success about why the society can function and the way that it functions as a successful democracy. Another bit about their outsized influence on the world: 10 million people again. They've created Skype, Spotify, very early adopters of cell phones and telephone technology with Ericsson. The zipper, famously the 3-point seatbelt, which Volvo said we're not going to have a patent for this. It's too important. It'll save many lives if we release the patent to everyone. A Swedish person also came up with the pacemaker. Yes. So again, the indicators of being a successful country: the output, this world's second most innovative economy, very vibrant startup scene, lots of a good business environment, you could say. I wrote here, lots of people think of Sweden as maybe socialist, that they have very high taxes, which, pay for large social programs, which is true. They have high taxes, and they do have free college. They have healthcare for everyone, but they also not only have low corruption, but people, not just the rich people, pay high taxes. All people pay high taxes. They have more of a flatter, less progressive tax system. And progressive, I mean that, if you're very poor, you pay a lower percentage of taxes. And if you're very rich, then you pay a high percentage. In Sweden, it's more like, everyone makes at least around maybe 30,000 euros, but everyone pays, even if you're making 30,000 euros a year, you're still paying like at least 35% taxes on that. I don't know the exact number at the moment, but I know that it's less progressive of a tax system as the U.S. one. The difference being, like, there's, besides income tax, there's very high, like sales tax, which is a more regressive tax. Like, think California, where there's a state sales tax of like 10% on everything. Their sales tax, you'll see it at the bottom of the check. If you ever go to Sweden, it'll be like a VAT tax, and it'll say like, oh, you paid this much extra, and it's much higher. I think it can be like 20%. And that's why you'll wonder, like, wow, my everything's so much more expensive. Yes, because of these extra taxes, which not only affect the rich, they affect every single person who's there. So that's as pretty much as flat of a tax as you can get. Also, very liberal, open society. The Corruption Perception Index, which is the best measurement of corruption in society. Sweden often ranks right up there with the other Scandinavian countries. As you can see, they're number 4, and I think this was 2016 or 17. Yes, okay. So the way I showed it was that the little small history lesson I did was the perception of Sweden as a socialist country came from the 60s and 70s when they started to discuss it as a society. The idea of Marx was that capitalism would build the infrastructure that would be necessary to lead into a communist society where everything was produced for the workers, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to give you a communism lesson. But as you can see from these graphs, capitalism had really positively affected Sweden's economy and their people from 1850, where they had basically average global wage, which for Northern Europe was terrible, to rapidly rising to the early 1900s, 1.5 by 1900, over double the average global wage by 1925. By 1970 or the early 1970s, they had nearly triple the average global wage. And part of the reason for that was they had a very positive form of free markets and globalism. They were highly export driven. They also did not have a war in the last 200 years. So before the 1850s, I think the last war they were in was 1820s, if I'm not mistaken. And so it's been over 200 years, or almost 200 years. I must be wrong, because I know it's over 200 years. The war must have been, the last war they must have had was before that. But yeah, so they've had this great amount of economic growth. And then you see it stop off here right at the top in the late 70s. And that was because during the early 70s, they implemented like actual socialist programs where they began to take over the means of production. Every company had to have these shares, buyback shares, where a percentage of their profits went towards the state buying shares of their company So the more profits they made, the more they weren't owned by the company anymore. And like taxes got really high in this time, and their ranking amongst OECD countries started to dip. By the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, they had a big problem. They were amongst the lower end of the OECD countries. And that's not because their wages had depressed, but maybe because their taxes became so high. And their efficiency in their government wasn't as efficient, let's say. So you had the bust. And by the 80s, they realized they needed to change something. There were a lot of factors going into it. There were depressions, normal market fluctuations, but also the fact that the krona was pegged, and they couldn't adjust their inflation rates. So yeah, they kept the krona pegged, so the inflation rates couldn't adjust. In '85, it's been a while since I actually did this slide, and a lot of the slides that I did came from when I was studying more in college. But it's something I've been kind of small, like on the side, studying for the better part of my adult life now. Yeah, so basically they kind of had a mini banking crisis like the US had in 2008. However, the way they went about doing it was they had you could only describe it as a socialist moment where the banks took, or the state took money from the people to save the banks. But the way they did it was they did this thing called the Bankstøttesamned, which guaranteed all deposits and all bank deposits and all the creditors, outstanding debts. The government bought the banks that wouldn't recapitalize, but made the shareholders who own parts of the bank take most of the losses. So once confidence in the bank started to return, the government sold off the assets for a profit. They had a bank support authority. It was supported by both the right and the left, done transparently. There was high amount of trust in the people to get things done, despite the problems that they had, which the government created not less than 10 years ago. So eventually the costs of this bailout were almost negligible. Okay. Basically, they were able to, like their system, their way of doing things, helped them ride out the 2008 global crisis, where you can see the debt to GDP for non-Sweden countries, or this is U.S. debt to GDP, and then this is Sweden's debt to GDP. Obviously, lower is better, and the U.S. ended up doing worse than Sweden. I'm not an economist, but I've dabbled. Basically, their economy was set up to help them a lot, even though they were very export driven. Their economy was like, you would imagine that they would be very hurt by a global recession because it's export driven, because they have a lot of international assets, liabilities with a large banking sector. They were very exposed. They've had problems in the past being very exposed. But their national bank, the Riksbank, immediately provided liquidity and introduced trust funds for banks, which they must pay into, and the banks had to have their own bailout fund. So how did the banks and the politicians and all the people come to understanding that I could not foresee happening in the US? I could not foresee happening in a lot of other places. Part of it is Swedish society, Swedish culture. One of their sayings, den som vill vara med om visten var också kallas vid förlutsen. If you roughly translate it, it's not, I mean, it's the meaning I take from it is if you share the gains, you also share the losses. So in this case, the taxpayer could only be the last lender of resort. I think when Obama bailed out the banks, that was the idea. But I don't think many Americans believe that that really was the last, like that they tried everything before that they used taxpayer bailout money. And the reason why it would work in Sweden is because they trust their institutions and politicians. There's this, open debate and willingness to speak about problems in a mature way, where they're not trying to create conflict all the time. They were in the early 1700s. I wrote the date down later, but they're the first country to make free speech, free press part of their culture, and that kind of says a lot. Yeah. Another saying, blott Sverige svensk krusbär har. Only Sweden has Swedish gooseberries. So Sweden is a unique country. Like I said, it's for democracy to work, you need to have kind of these ideas and these things about their culture, so that people can discuss issues. This European Commission report guy Lars Jonung said it may be difficult for other countries to mobilize the same type of social capital that was needed in order to make the Swedish approach successful. And it's possibly true. You might need a different way of governing if you don't have this kind of social capital. If you don't have this trust in institutions, the ability to speak openly about other things. Also, voter turnout is very high, and it's even over demographics. I don't know where I got that statistic, but it was from somewhere. Here I wrote, okay, the first country to have a free press, 1766. So before the US existed as a country, they had it in their constitution. I think it's one of 4 or 5 pillars of their society, along with that they have a king, the right of succession, that the government is represented, like government representatives are from the people, the free press, and there's something else, right? And from all this, they can do a lot of things better. Like an educated public can make educated public decisions with public money. An uneducated public, I mean, it seems obvious, but maybe it's not so obvious. An uneducated public cannot make good decisions about where public money should go, especially if they can't. I mean, there's another level to it. Even if the public is educated, if they can't trust their government to what they will do with their money, I mean, it doesn't matter if they're educated or not. Okay, right? And so here, bottom right, this is kind of too small, but it shows the public trust in institutions. Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, Finland's not Scandinavian. Very high public trust in institutions. Although, I have heard that lately this is going down in these countries. It was an issue that was starting to come up as I was studying this. I haven't studied as much recent history, but I did recently see that for the first time in a long time, they usually have a question about, like, would you take public money that you weren't supposed to get or that you weren't entitled to? And for most of their time as a country that they asked this, over 50% said they would not do that. I think maybe last year was the first year that it was like 40, it was under 50%, like 49% said they would take it. Here, living in a country like Ukraine, I imagine that 99% of people would say, yeah, take that money. That's your money, get your money. And I mean, I can't think it would be that much different in the U.S. either. That and probably a lot of people would say to try to get that money if you can. Um, if you can find the loophole, right? If you can find the loophole in the tax code, exploit it. It's tax avoidance or whatever, not tax abuse. I don't know. I don't know what people are saying. Maybe I'm controversial. So yeah, I had to do some parts about education too. And in education, you can really see where the fruits of their society kind of really blossom. They have the regular, education. They have what people in a lot of people in the U.S. think. Oh, they have preschool education from the time they're born. Parents can send their kids to a preschool. They can go to Forschola, and they even have a preschool. So like from when they're 1, they can go and have like daycare if the parents are both working, and this is state funded. But I mean, you can look at the numbers. Americans still pay more for school in terms of taxes, their tax dollars, than Swedes do. Yet it seems like Swedes get a better quality. So why is it so good? Why is the output so good? So in 1992, they allowed private schools to exist, and not just like exist, but exist within the marketplace of public education. So they gave what a lot of people refer to as like vouchers, where they have like a coupon for every child, and each child can use this voucher. Or when I say child, I mean the parents can choose where their kids go to school. Any school that accepts these must do so without discrimination. You can't have a test, or you can't have like a way of discriminating other than like a list, right? And you can just first come, first serve. So like the best schools, the kids' parents are probably going to put them on the list when they're born to go to like the good high school, right? And with that, you get an amount of diversity. You get lower class or lower income students with higher income students, but they're all, they all can get the best education. And you might think, okay, this will just push all the public schools out of the realm. Well, no, it just makes competition, and the public schools have to get better. They get better, and they learn, okay, well, look what they're doing. More families want to send their kids there. Can we do this? And the schools that don't run well, they don't get funding. They don't get enough students, and they go bye-bye. But the good ones, they can open up more schools and use that money to make education better for the whole country, right? It's not that profit's the enemy. It's what kind of outcome do you want, right? Yeah, so that's part of why their education got so good. That's kind of the input. You work all this, do all this work to have a good society, be open, speak, have a good government. What do you get? Maybe you can, in decades, have a school system that functions in a competitive atmosphere where all kids have the ability to access quality education. And yeah, so here's my overview. Finally, I know this has gone on pretty long, but first, what do you need? What are the inputs that you need to get this output of Sweden? Input: you need to have peace. They're not spending all this extra money on fighting wars, right? War is incredibly expensive, not only in cost of money, but human capital as well. Like, you're making a lot of people focus on building guns and tanks, and operating those guns and tanks, dying in those guns and tanks, and you're losing those people, which could be, helping your economy. They're an open country in more than just they're open about talking about different topics. They're also open towards immigration. And I know that they were very open towards taking in refugees. At one point, I think they have up to maybe 10% of their country in the last 5-10 years has become an immigrant population, which is incredible, and I know they've had some issues integrating because it's something new for them. But when you have these pillars in their society of being open to speak about them, I can be fairly confident that that's something that they're going to be able to understand and fix. And since their education program is so strong, even if there's one generation of immigration who don't necessarily function the best in their society, their kids are going to grow up and understand how their system works. And I mean, when I did my study abroad there, they had two young people who were in their early 20s. They were children of immigrants. One, I think, was Kurdish, maybe from the Levant area, and the other was a child of Chinese immigrants. They both spoke English, Swedish, and the mother tongue of their parents extremely well. They understood Swedish culture enough that they were helping us teach and learn Swedish culture, and also they were communicating to us the problems and issues that they faced as immigrants. I know they had a word for it, a slang word, where they're not like quote unquote Swedish, but it was so amazing that, like, I didn't realize it then, but thinking back, that they're so upfront about this problems that they face as immigrants, who they are. It's not something that was hidden from society. These are people that I met in the first couple of weeks, and they're telling me all of this information about them. So I'm confident that that's something that they can get through and integrate these people into society, even in their society, even if it's something that's relatively new, new culture and new ways of thinking for their society. Some other things, yeah. So they got their pillars of society, and then they become outputs. The output of their pillars of society, their open country, openness, their peacefulness, is highly developed infrastructure, high levels of innovation, a highly export-driven industry, which like makes them compete around the world all the time. So their businesses are always right there, like cutting edge with innovation. They're also, this money allows them to be highly generous, allows them to donate a lot of money, and allows them to be have that really good PR about their country, enough so that maybe politicians in America demonize them for some shortcomings, but there's shortcomings in every country, and you have to look at the tenets of the society, and are they following them? Are those things they're working through? And I think you can look at Sweden, and despite there are problems, they have had issues with immigration. They've had issues in the past of trying things, and maybe they don't work out, but they have had a pretty good track record, I would say, of improvement. And I think if there's a takeaway of how they got to this part in their society, I look towards the openness, that ability, again, to sit down, have that fika, that coffee, have some cake, and talk about, be open, not afraid of sharing what the problems are. You're not going to offend them. You're not going to offend each other when you're talking about something, which in the end, after you talk about it and solve it, both of you will be better off. And this is something that I hoped that people took away from what I did at the ULA speech. And if you sat through this and listened to this whole thing, I hope that you can take that away too. Okay, I'm going to wrap that up. That was way too long, but thanks for listening to me talk if you went through that whole thing. I'll see you next time. I've been Mackie Chang.